Welcome to a Leader's Journey podcast. I'm your host, Joel Gunn. Lashaude's back with me on the show today. Welcome back.
Hey.
You know, and I think most of the audience has probably figured out, one of my primary interest in life is figuring out how to help people integrate their faith in the marketplace, mix business and faith, in a way that's winsome, in a way that's proper, but living out your fully who you are as a leader. If faith is a big part of your life, well, then integrate that into the workplace and allow people to express their faith, or if they choose not to have one, help them, still have a better life being on your team. And so kind of a setup question, because you and I we know where we're going with this episode, so I want to kind of set this up more for the audience than for you. But it's been let me turn it into a question. Do you think most employees would, if Jesus were here today, do you think most employees would want to work for the Jesus we read about in the New Testament and in the Gospels?
Yeah, I think if you were to ask them, they would say no. But if they were to experience it, the answer would definitely be a resounding yes.
And why do you think that is? What was it about Jesus that drew so many people of all different walks? I mean, there was very few people thought poorly of him, and those that did were the religious leaders that felt threatened by his, the fact that people are following him and adoring him because they could feel the love coming from him and the compassion coming from him, and they weren't sensing that from their spiritual leaders. In fact, they were feeling bondage or whatever, and so that group felt threatened. But pretty much everybody else, I mean, he interacted with all kinds of people, all walks of life. In fact, the religious leaders accused him of mixing with the wrong crowd, but people just loved hanging out with him, and they're drawn to him by the thousands, literally.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I mean, if you think about it, he knew how to build a team. Right? He knew team dynamics when people would argue and jostle over, who's going to have the greatest promotion package. And he was able to have those talks about compensation. And he knew how to put together a good team. He knew how to be really clear and set expectations that this is not going to be easy. Right? And I've told you these things beforehand. So he was able to cast vision for the future. He was able to prep his team really well. He had a great onboarding program where you watched him do things, and then he did it with them, and then you were sent out to do it. So you weren't just thrown into the fire to figure out how to do ministry on your own, but you actually walked with him for a long period of time while he trained you on the job. He was emotionally healthy, like he wasn't lashing out unnecessarily. And even if you were confused at what he was doing or why he was doing it, you still trusted him because he doesn't seem like the person to act irrationally. He seemed to have a great balance of his inner life. He would pray often. He would go away and practice silence and solitude. He seemed to set really good boundaries and clear expectations of his team members.
Had a healthy diet.
Had a healthy diet. I mean, so I feel like people would want to work with and for Jesus. He was able to offboard people who needed to be offboarded. He was able to say clear. He was able to say things that were difficult to hear. And if people weren't willing to get along with the program, he was okay with losing people. He wasn't desperate to onboard people because he was short-staffed. So if somebody came to him and the motives weren't right, or they weren't willing to accept his teachings and they were going to walk away, well, he wasn't going to chase them down and try to onboard them to get them on the team. He wasn't driven by the numbers. He was driven by quality, and so I think a lot of the habits of Jesus would make for a really great boss. And I think that's why personally, I'm biased. I think that's why I serve him as king and as leader. But yeah.
So how do we walk that out, right? Because the word Christian means to be like Christ, like Jesus. And so I think most of the time people that aren't Christians think poorly of us because we don't do that. We don't walk it out. We don't live it out. What's been your experience, or what are some of the ways you're finding to walk that out? What's this all about?
Yeah. So I'm called to love, and I try to love all my clients and my employees through my business, and they can feel it because at every policy point is really a point where I can show that I love you and set clear expectations and boundaries. That's all this is. The policy we have on vacation or time off or sick leave or things like that, that's a place where I can show you that I love you and set clear boundaries and expectations of what you can expect from my love. When we think about like the laws of God in the Old Testament, they're supposed to reveal something about the heart of God to us. They're supposed to be a joy to us, right? And so every policy and rule you have in your small business is that same opportunity. Now, if it grows cold and it turns into a checklist and it turns into just legalism, and we lose the heart of the Father and we lose the heart of God in the rules, well, then that's when businesses just have, HR manuals and rules that we use to just bash people over the head with, like, hey, you
becomes punitive.
It becomes very punitive in nature. Yeah. And that's the experience most people have with Scripture and God, is that these are all rules that I shouldn't break. They're not actually seen as good and wise and for me and loving towards me. And so I think I'm able to embody in my small business that every rule has love behind it. And I want to show you why this is here. And I think that the more I explain why a rule is in place, people realize the intentionality and that there is love behind each of these boundaries and each of these rules.
As we were chatting before the show, you said work is a place where people are formed, right? And obviously there's character formation, there's skill formation, there's team formation. Like, there's a lot of paths we could go. But one that was near and dear to your heart today, at least, was this idea of spiritual formation through work. Unpack that for us.
Yeah. So let's think of spiritual formation outside of work. Well, if you were to disciple someone, or let's just take Jesus. Like, if Jesus is discipling people, he's teaching them how life is supposed to be lived. He's teaching them what is good to do and what's not good to do, and then he's showing them practices on, like, here's how to pray, here's the rhythms of life you need to have. And if you were to disciple someone, you start thinking in your head, you think, okay, I need to teach them, like, okay, how to approach God and how life should be lived. And when they come to me with life events, I want to coach them, right? And so when I say work is spiritual formation, what I'm saying is, when I hire somebody, the first thing they ask me is, what do you want me to do? Right? Can you explain my job to me and what you want me to do? How will I be rewarded, and what are you looking for in a type of employee? And so I get the opportunity then to reward them for things like honesty, reward them for things like integrity. I get a chance to correct them whenever they're dishonest or they're late or they do something that's not loving or they do something that's unkind. I get a chance to correct them, and I'm not correcting them with the end result just being my business is profitable. I believe the profitability of my business is a byproduct of them being fully formed into the image of God. And I might not have to say that to them, but if I just tell them honesty is better than lying, I believe that the business will grow directly as a byproduct of them being a more honest person. If I tell them that they shouldn't try to just separate their home and work life, or they shouldn't try to, like, have a terrible home life and still try to be a great employee, that they need to focus on the overall health of their body and their soul. I don't have to tell them how to do that, but I can tell them, you can't be a good employee if you're not a healthy individual. So please prioritize your individual health. I don't mind paying for counseling. I don't mind you paying for gym memberships or things like that so that you can be healthy, because I believe a byproduct of your health, of your body and of your soul, that my business will profit from that. And so when I say work is spiritual formation, work forms you into a type of person. It forms you into a type of person. And so I want to be able to use my business to do that. Think of Genesis, opening pages of the Bible, when God creates humanity and he gives them a job. We're co-laboring with God because for some reason that pleases God, and it's actually forming us. We're going somewhere with God, right? We're given a job and we're given a master and someone to co-labor with. If you think about when Israel was enslaved in Egypt, and they wanted to just take a 3-day sabbatical to go worship God, what did Pharaoh say? Pharaoh said, double their labor, make it harder for them, and they will forget about all of this God stuff. What was Pharaoh? What did Pharaoh know that we're missing out on? Is that work is spiritual formation. And if I cram your brain with a bunch of work-related stuff, and I overstress you, and you feel like you're in a place of lack, and your job's on the line or your life is on the line, chances are you're not going to maybe focus on trusting God or thinking of a new business venture. If I could just cram your head full of so much work, you don't even have an imagination when you leave this place to think about what God might be trying to do in your life, because you are just completely overworked. And so I like to take the opportunity to not be like that. I don't want to be a slave driver, a taskmaster. I want to reward people for honesty. I want to hopefully correct and discipline people when they're doing things that I don't think are best for human flourishing. And I get to, and I think all leaders have an obligation to do that. We can step up into our roles of leadership and form people and reward them for the things that are great for human flourishing. Yeah.
How do you, and we touched a bit on this the first time I met you and interviewed you here, but how do you, for those that might have missed that episode, or even if they heard it, how do you process that with new employees? How do you set them up? Like, maybe they've never worked for a guy like you before, and you know, you're lovable and you're fun to be around, but all of a sudden you start using these concepts and talking about these concepts of, I want to help you flourish. I want to help you, integrity is important, and I want to walk you through that. And how do you start to set those people up to have those conversations? What are some of those early conversations look like?
Yeah, really simply, it's core values that always land on a policy that is extremely clear, an outward expression of that policy. So for example, if you were to come work for me for one of your first days, I'll pull out our core values. We call them the high five. One of them is we don't treat people like scenery or machinery. Scenery is just something that blends into the background of your life. They're just objects, right? Machinery are things that are transactional. I just need you to do something and I take your money and then we do this thing, right? We don't treat people like scenery or machinery because all people have intrinsic value that is more valuable than an object. We don't treat people like objects, right? Now, I don't have to tell them I'm talking about Imago Dei language. I don't have to go into how God has formed them in the womb or anything like that. But I can say we don't treat people like scenery or machinery because all people have intrinsic value, okay? Now, what's the policy? What's the thing I'm going to expect you to do? We call people by their name. We don't say, hey, buddy. We don't say, hey, friend. We don't say, hey, guy. You call a student by their name, because they have intrinsic value. They're not an object. They have intrinsic value. I expect you to address their needs. I expect you to address their names. And there's a few more policies that are attached to that. But if you had to, even if you don't necessarily agree that you shouldn't treat humans like scenery or machinery, I'm telling you, this is what is expected of you. You are not allowed to give them a dehumanized name. You will call them their name when you refer to them. And we say hi and bye to them when they walk in and when they walk out. We acknowledge them. They're not in the background of everything they do. They are what we're doing. They're the focus of this theater that we're doing here, this show or this business. They're not in the background of it. They come first before anything else, before any admin work we have to do or computers. If a student is within 5 feet of you, they get your full attention, right? So I don't have an anti-cell phone policy. I have a for-student policy, a for-people policy. There's no technology or administrative task that should supersede taking care of that student. So to answer your question, how do I take these pie-in-the-sky biblical concepts that I want people to embody, is I'll start with a value, and hopefully you agree with it or not, but then I will always land it in a job expectation, a clear, visible, measurable outcome from this core value that I will ask you to adhere to. And I've never had anyone say they're unwilling to do that thing. And what ends up happening is, as you practice those lower level outcomes, you start to actually believe this is a better way to live life. And instead of me discipling you with just your brain and concepts and principles, I'm discipling you with your body. You will embody this truth, and then you'll come to know that it's true. So I can go more into that, but there's a bidirectional relationship between what we know and what we do with our bodies. Some people think I can think something and act differently, but you can actually act differently to think a new thing, and that's the direction I'm going. Maybe you don't like the core value approach that's mental and theoretical, but you will be nice to my team members and friends, and maybe in 2 or 3 months you realize, you know what, now I've changed my mind because my boss asked me to do this thing in this way. Now it's made its way to my mind, and now I agree with it mentally as well.
A lot of people may not realize this, but I'm assuming it's still around, but about 25 30 years ago, I got to go to a day-long Disney university. So Disney actually had a division that they train people, how to create the magic. And I know you're magicians, so.
Oh man, don't get me started.
But that division was created to help businesses do things better, right? And so one of the things I remember I'm talking about that day was they don't hire employees, they hire actors. And so they overcame the, I don't want to do that. Well, it doesn't really matter if you want to do that. That's the way you're going to act, because Disney World or Disneyland is a large stage, and you're being hired to act like the friendliest janitor on the planet. And your role as you're acting out this role, you're going to smile when people, you're going to whistle while you work, you're going to write. That's how they create the magic, is because employees don't come in just to do a job. They come in to act out a job, right? Mm-hmm. And so it was a subtle thing, but it was a way that they kind of superseded the norm of what's my job description. And it sounds a lot like what you're describing, is where you help people really connect instead of with the head. These are the policies to connect with the heart of it. These are our core values, and it's embodied like this. Mm-hmm. Well, the longer you live that out, and and actors talk about method acting and how I had to get into the role, right? Mm-hmm. And put myself in that position. Mm-hmm. Well, then it came across as very authentic on screen, because they had embodied that character, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think absolutely there's more than one source that would agree with what you've shared. That as people, as your employees are trained to acknowledge somebody as they walk in the door, it becomes part of who they are. It just becomes natural. Mm-hmm. There was an ice cream shop. I think they're still around. But anybody would tip, the whole crew would stop and sing a jingle, mm-hmm. right? And while they're working, right? Mm-hmm. And they had 3 or 4 of them that they'd all memorized.
Like Cold Stone Creamery, I think, does that sometimes?
Yeah, I wasn't going to mention the name, but that's okay.
Sorry, we're not allowed to drop names on here?
No, it's fine.
Okay.
Anyway, yeah, so but it was fun, right? Yeah. As a patron, I'd almost put a tip in just to hear them sing, right?
Yeah.
But think about, they had different personalities. Not every one of them would go into a public place and just start singing, mm-hmm. but that was part of their culture. That mm-hmm. was an expectation. And so it probably was really weird at first, mm-hmm. but yet it became the norm, mm-hmm. At least for that setting. Mm-hmm. I think there's something to be said for. And if you want to geek out on that a little bit more about this whole idea of act it out, it becomes part of your thoughts, or think it out, it becomes part of your actions.
Oh my goodness. So all the habit literature is trending in that direction of saying if you want to form a habit, it comes from a new identity, but new identities are formed by these micro habits that you do. So I don't know if it was James Clear that wrote Atomic Habits, and he talks about the relationship of casting votes for the person you want to be by slowly doing 2-minute habits that turn you into an athlete. And from that new identity, you then form the new habit. You can go down that rabbit trail as much as you want to. I would just say that there is a bi-directional relationship between how you feel and what you do. So how you feel will inform what you do, but what you do will inform how you feel. There's literature out there that talks about how smiling makes you feel happy on the inside, or power poses making you feel confident. There's all sorts of stuff out there, but the research is clear that what you do influences how you think. Mm-hmm. And if that's true, then instead of me trying to make you think differently about generosity, humanity, honesty, integrity, love, charity, compassion, empathy. Like, I could try to train you on those things from an intellectual level and hope it lands somewhere in your actions, or I can make it part of your performance evaluation and part of what I expect from you as an employer and as an employee. Mm-hmm. I can make it part of our expectations. And as you fulfill those expectations, you start to then come to know that this is a better way to live life. And you, I think, start to carry that into your personal life as a person who are now walking in the ways of Jesus, whether or not you're familiar with him as the source of these mm-hmm. habits. Mm-hmm. You start walking in his ways, which I think lays the groundwork. And I think, and to be really clear, eventually, hopefully somebody, maybe a pastor, preacher, or a Christian that's playing that role of pastor in that person's life will talk about salvation and atonement and those what we would consider like giving a gospel presentation. But we're able to talk about the kingdom of God and demonstrate it. I could tell you I'm the bread of life, or I can feed you and then tell you I'm the bread of life. You could experience your way into. I could tell you that in the kingdom of God, there's no sickness and that there's healing and that there's peace, or I could heal you, feed you, show you peace, show you forgiveness, and show you grace, and you'll understand it as you're experiencing it. And
which is what Jesus did. I mean, his whole, if you look at his ministry, most of it was experiential, right? And then he'd tie it together with intellectual understanding, right, or principle or concept, but one of the reasons he told stories is to pull people into the story and then say, and this is what that means in the real world. Okay, now I got it. But if you just issued the policy, or the mandate or the law, people would have a hard time connecting the two, perhaps, with the real world and the day-to-day. And have you always had this understanding, or is it something that you've kind of grown into?
This is definitely something I've grown into. I think I started from a place of thinking I have to give a gospel presentation to my employees or I'm not discipling them. And I'm like, well, that feels weird because that seems like something a pastor would do, but not something a boss would do. And those two worlds seem so distant from each other. And I felt guilty. And I think this is the guilt most Christians feel, or most faith leaders feel, where they want to go into full-time ministry as opposed to being in the marketplace, because they just don't see the kingdom of God being moving forward in that space. And so we kind of abandon that post to do what we think is that. And so that's what my head was. I wanted to quit accounting. So I have a master's degree in accounting, but I wanted to quit doing accounting and go to full-time divinity school or, biblical studies school. And God told me, no, he didn't want me to do that. Didn't quite know why, but he was like, nope, I don't want you to do that. I wanted to quit football, wanted to quit the university I was going to and go join like a religious university. He told me, no, you need to stay where you're at. And I was like, okay, well, how am I going to follow you if I'm not how am I going to be a Christian if I'm not going to be the professional Christian? So, but he was faithful to answer that question. So I started from a place where the two worlds were completely separated. And then slowly, as they were becoming more integrated into my life, it became more clear how the overlap was, for my small business. So
we need to pause and wrap up this episode right there. I want to come back in the next week episode, and let's pick up there, because that's where a lot of business leaders, I think, struggle. Is they see like two different, from a religious perspective, they see different classes of people. There's the pastor and the priest, right? The spiritual leader, whatever they call that in their, in their religion. And then there's the rest of us, right? And your experience found that those two could both be fruitful. So I want to pick up with that in the next episode.
All right, let's do it.
All right. Thanks, brother. Thanks for joining us for this episode of A Leader's Journey podcast. If you enjoyed it, give us a thumbs up and remember to subscribe to our channel.